Fantastic. Speaking of writings,
Yeah.
in many times after a meeting or a Bible study here at Calvary, I would overhear you fielding questions and answering questions, and even a couple weeks ago, you were discussing with some people about such issues like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what that would have to do with us today.
Yeah.
And that hasn't been something I've just heard you talk about 2 weeks back, but over the years that I've known you, you're often asked about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Sure.
What are they? Why do they matter?
I think they are probably something a lot of people have heard about.
Yeah.
I mean, Dead Sea Scrolls is a pretty common thing that people have heard about. They are extremely significant in the understanding of the theology of the New Testament, I think.
Okay.
Because you're looking at a community of Jewish people living around the time of Jesus and the centuries before him. And from textual criticism, it's highly significant because these are the earliest copies of the Hebrew Bible that we have. Substantial copies that we have. There are earlier inscriptions like the silver scrolls and things like that go back even before the destruction of the temple, back to the 7th century BC. But the Dead Sea Scroll communities, we're looking at scrolls from the 3rd BC up until the 1st century AD, and we're looking at a massive corpus of biblical texts. And so the textual critic is fascinated to see what did the Bible read like in the days of Jesus. So that's their significance. And what the evidence has shown us is without doubt that the Bible that would have been read by Jews in the 1st century is, to all extents and purposes, the same as what we read today. Yes, there are cases of textual variation. The overwhelming cases of textual variation in the Dead Sea Scrolls are orthographical changes, spelling. But I mean, the way we spell a word today is not the way that the King James in the 1611 spelled the word.
And certainly the way that I spell words is different than you.
Right.
My American
dropping all these U's.
I'm trying to put them back, but it's hard. But so one could even compare my writing to your writing, and
absolutely.
I would notice some of those things. Okay.
But I think the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls is seen in the fact that these are scrolls from a community that is not necessarily the representative of the best of the Jewish scriptoria, because the community at Qumran, that area, we would recognize generally, and the consensus among scholars is that they were probably Essenes, or a radical branch of Essenes.
Yeah.
And from the writings of the Dead Sea Scroll communities, they had huge problems with Jerusalem, with the temple, with the priesthood. They saw it as corrupt. They wanted to separate themselves from that. And so, by virtue of that, this tiny community and the copies that they make are representative of the common or the popular script. So it's not even representative of the temple script, the very best that the Jewish scribes had to offer.
Yeah.
And so you're actually looking at the Dead Sea Scroll community, you're looking at probably the least accurate of the scribal traditions in the 1st century. And yet, I mean, you can buy a copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls translated into English, and you can read it, and you're not coming up with a different view of God's plan of salvation for Israel. It's amazing. Something that people don't know about a lot is that the Dead Sea Scroll community, it was destroyed in the war 66 to 73, so that was the last they wrote. But there are scrolls from around the Judean wilderness from a little time later, even from the beginning of the 2nd century. So you have scrolls from outside the Qumran community. They found scrolls at Masada. They found scrolls at Nachal Hever, which is in the West Bank. And so these are scrolls that were connected with a different community. These are scrolls that are linked to the Zealots.
Okay.
And why is that significant? It's significant because the Zealots were very much tied into the temple. They were very much part of mainstream Judaism. And so when we look at those scrolls, we would hope to see the very best in Jewish scribal practice. And what do we see? Emmanuel Tov, he's a Hebrew textual critic, he talks about this in his book, The Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible. And when he talks about the scrolls from the Judean wilderness, particularly the Zealot scrolls, he says that there are not even any way significant changes between the consonantal text of those scrolls and the very, very end of the medieval Masoretic text. They read the same thing. So that is amazing, I think, and we can have great confidence that when we read the Hebrew Bible, we're reading a translation that accurately reflects at least what the Bible read in Jesus' day, but certainly what the Bible read going back into the very best of the temple scribal tradition, going back centuries before the fall of the temple to the Babylonians. And that's highly significant. Another thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that some of the scrolls are written in the normal Hebrew alphabet, which is what we call the Aramaic script, even though it's not Aramaic language. But some of the scrolls, particularly scrolls from the Pentateuch and the Book of Job, are written in what's called Paleo-Hebrew. Paleo-Hebrew is the script that Jews used before the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians and they went into captivity. These scrolls don't date from that period, but they are copies of scrolls that reflect the text before the fall of the temple. And these texts, without doubt, always reflect the Masoretic text, which is the standard biblical text that we would work from. And so these are representative of the very most ancient scrolls that the community had access to, and those are among the most accurate that the Dead Sea Scroll community had. So I think that's fascinating.
That's interesting. Now let's talk about what the Dead Sea Scrolls do not contain, because over the years, I've heard people talk about, well, I heard that in the Dead Sea Scrolls it had such and such. I think
such and such what?
Well, a lot of this I guess would come from popular media or from films. I think that the film Stigmata, at the end of it, it said that the Dead Sea Scrolls contained these sort of things which were covered by the Vatican. So what's in them? What is the Dead Sea Scrolls? What were in those jars?
It's not a secret.
Okay.
If you go to Eason's, Giza Hermes, he has published in Penguin Classics the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can go and read the translation of them into English, the entire corpus of the non-biblical scrolls. So you're looking at what did the community write. There's nothing in there about Jesus. Okay, there isn't, and that's fine. Why would we expect a very conservative Essene community to be concerned with Jesus? That's not at all what they were writing, and there's scrolls that date from centuries before him anyway, so I mean, it's ludicrous to even expect that they would be writing about Jesus at this time. They don't mention anything about secret gospels or anything like that. There just isn't those things. I think part of the problem with this idea of there being a conspiracy with the Dead Sea Scrolls is the way that scholarship works. You see, when people get a grant from a university to invest time in researching and writing dissertations and papers on the Dead Sea Scrolls, it takes time. That information isn't released into the public domain until the research is done, until the universities get what they want from it, because they're the ones paying the scholars, until they get to write it up in scholarly journals, until it's reviewed by peers. And so for years, people maybe were wondering what was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and maybe part of this conspiracy theory is like, why won't they tell us? That's just the way scholarship works, is that you have to be careful, you review these things, it takes time. But the evidence is there for you today if you want to pick up and read what the result of this scholarship is. And I think people love conspiracies, but it's a lot less dramatic.
Sure. And it's a lot easier to watch a film than to go to Eason's, buy a book, and read it. Unfortunately,
it is.
And that's kind of how a lot of information is just transferred down, just pop culture and conspiracy themed films. Unfortunately, but it's wonderful that even a question like that has zero to little basis in any kind of reality, we could say, that's a good question, and let's talk about it.
I think as well with the Dead Sea Scroll community, it's interesting when you do read their writings. I think the gospel writer John certainly uses a lot of the same pictures and images as some of the writers from Qumran. Light and darkness is a major theme in the writings of the Jews in this time. And one of the arguments against the early date of John was his use of these ideas of light and darkness. It seems a very Hellenistic, a very Greek way of looking at, you know, the world and goodness and evil in these terms. And so they would say this is, you know, Gospel of John talks a lot about I'm the light of the world and all these things of darkness and light. That seems to say that maybe the Gospel of John is written quite late, maybe the 2nd century by someone. But from the studies of what the Jews, you know, in the centuries leading up to Christ and in the 1st century writing, those were very common things for Jewish writers to express the theology of the 1st century in. And so I think it validates that the thought process of the Apostle John is very much rooted in the Jewish heritage of Palestine in the 1st century, not in some esoteric 2nd century Greek influenced idea.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Especially considering that the Qumran community would have nothing to do with any kind of Hellenistic or Greek thought.
Very hostile.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So that they're useful.
They are.
Although they don't contain New Testament manuscripts or anything else, they're useful in showing what Jews thought like in the 1st century, and that's where the New Testament came from as well, or at least the good chunk of it.
Absolutely.
Okay.